they had to interfere with the main nerve to the body and to my right eye. And at that point, the operation was to keep me alive. At no point was it ever considered that I was going to be in any state of...
Hello again, everybody. My name is John D Healy. I do a podcast. It's called It's Good to Talk. I always have interest in people on to tell their stories. Today will be no exception. People know me because I produced this book for my good friend Stoney McGurn. It's his life story from 1941 up to a few years ago. All his life, from taxi driving and truck driving and bartending and living in New York City in the 60s and 70s and 80s indeed. Lots of interest in history, all true stories as well. My sponsors are Liffey Van Lines, a moving company here in New York City, and they've been around as long as Jeopardy, so that's a long time. You can't buy experience when it comes to moving that Liffey do the lifting, because they do moving and storage all over the city. Now, I do have a special guest today, as I said to you. His name is Declan Murphy. He's an Irish guy, like myself. He was born in Limerick. He has produced a book as well, like myself. His book has been very successful. It's won many awards, and it's quite an interesting story. So I'm going to get Declan rolling now. So Declan, welcome to my podcast number 1.
Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be on here with you.
Okay, so tell us a little about your background. I know you were born in Limerick, but give us a little backdrop.
Yes, just to give you a backstory to my life and the book, etc. I was born in a little village called Hospital, County Limerick. I was one of 8 children.
Okay.
I had 4 brothers and 3 sisters, and we essentially, my dad was an engineer in the waterworks, and we ran my uncle's farm.
Okay.
And basically, we always had access to the farm. We used to go milking the cows by hand, and my uncle was a great horseman, and he always had horses around the place.
Okay.
And that probably was where my interest in riding began. And then from there, my brothers were all older than me, and they all rode for my uncle and for a legend called Pat Hogan, P.P. Hogan.
Okay.
And I more or less followed their interests, being the youngest boy.
Okay.
And my brother Eamon got a pony, gifted a pony, and then we got left another pony that somebody just dropped it off and forgot to pick it up, and that sort of thing. And that's how we started riding. And I started riding really without any instruction or manual or anything.
Okay.
It's just a case of getting on the pony and you just riding it. You fall off it. You didn't have a chance to cry because nobody cared.
Okay.
So you got back on again.
Okay.
And my brother Eamon was 2 years older than me, and he had started pony racing. And one day, my dad had taken me to the horse races at Tipperary Racecourse, called Limerick Junction back then. And my brother Eamon and I looked alike. We were both blonde kids, and probably a lot of people didn't see the difference. But this guy on this day, Christy Doherty, didn't see a difference because he thought I was my brother Eamon. And he said, "Declan, would you ride my pony on Sunday at Dingle in the 14-2 pony race
in County Kerry?"
In County Kerry. And I said to him with all the confidence, "Well, of course I will." Right? So he said, "Great. And we'll see you on Sunday. Get your dad to drop me off at Newcastle West, and we'll go from there." So I told my dad that I've got to ride on Sunday in a pony race. And my dad said, "What are you talking about? You haven't ridden pony racing." And I said, "It doesn't matter, I can ride." So he dropped me back to Christy Doherty's in Newcastle West. And the pony was loaded on the horse box, and the pony was called String of Pearls.
Nice name.
String of Pearls was on the way to the races. And Christy Doherty was a really eccentric man. And he stopped the car and horse box halfway between Newcastle West and Dingle and let the pony out in a field for a roll. Just opened the gate of the field and let the pony have a roll. He said a roll was as good as a stone of oats, so it was very indicative of the well-being of the pony.
Okay.
So we go on to driving in the car, and he picked up at this stage that I wasn't aiming.
Right.
And he said, you've got no experience. I won't be able to let you ride the pony. I'll have to get somebody else to ride the pony. And I was,
let down.
I wasn't really let down, but I was thinking, oh, sure, that's his decision. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we're at the races, and Christy has got somebody else to ride the pony. And I overheard somebody talking behind a horse box saying they needed a rider for the 14-2 race.
Okay.
And I walked up with the same confidence as I did, to Christy Doherty the first time when I was pretending to be Eamon. Mm-hmm. Except this time, I walked up being myself. I said, hi, my name is Declan. I've ridden plenty of winners. I can ride the pony for you. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have the time to think whether this was how it's going to be or not. And so anyway, I get to ride on the pony. And it's in the same race as String of Pearls, who I went to the races to ride.
Right.
And I end up beating String of Pearls in a tight finish.
Right.
And this is where my story actually really began, because Christy Doherty could never say my name properly. He couldn't say the name Declan. He would call me Delkin. Okay. So I win the race, and everybody is delighted, and I've made my own little bit of history, and that year I would go on and become champion pony rider in Ireland, and it all started just from wanting to be like my brother Raymond at that point. Okay. And I was champion pony rider for 3 years following that in Ireland. And my mother, I used to do hunting as well, and my mother didn't like the fact that I was spending so much time with the ponies. She said your education was much more important. And for some reason, that same sort of emphasis was not placed on my siblings. It wasn't. She seemed to think that I and my eldest sister were the two people of the 8 that were probably better off being academics or better off being something like this. And of course, as a kid, you don't agree with this kind of thing. No. But anyway, I was 14 years old, and at this stage, my mother said, "That's it now. You got to stop the riding and focus on your education." So I had to stop the riding. I'd been champion pony rider for 3 years. And my brother Eamon was now at the racing stables of Kevin Prendergast, who trained on the Curragh in Ireland.
That's a big name, yeah.
And Kevin Prendergast, so at this stage now, I was 16. And at the age of 16, I went to spend the summer holidays with Eamon on the Curragh. And I went to ride out with Kevin Prendergast. And Kevin Prendergast came up to me one day and said, "You should be a jockey. You ride really well." And I said, "I've got no interest in being a jockey." I said, and I'm only going to be here for the summer, and then I'm going back to school. So I went back to school.
The Curragh and then too, yeah.
Sorry?
The Curragh is a big racetrack in Ireland.
Oh, the Curragh is, the Irish Derby is there. It's just an hour outside Dublin. It's a place where legend has been created and veiled, if you like. It's an amazing place. And then I went back to school, and I am now going into my 5th year at school. So I decided I'm going to go back to the Curragh. I was 17 years old at this stage now. I was just turning 17. I'm going to go back to the Curragh to spend the summer again with Eamon. So this day, again, I'm there about a week at the time, and it was the second week of June, and we finished school in Ireland. At that time, you always finished, the start of June was your holidays. June, July, yeah, 3 long months, June, July, and August. So after about the first week, I decided I want to go to the Curragh and, have some fun up there. So I go to the Curragh, and after about a week, I'm riding track work for Kevin Prendergast on the Curragh, and he came up to me and he said, "It's madness you not being a jockey." He said, "You should take out an amateur license. It won't cost you anything. And I'll have a ride for you on Monday." And this conversation is going on. And I said, "Well, Kevin, look, I've got no interest in having an amateur license or riding horses, and I thought that was the end of the conversation. And on the Saturday, Kevin Prendergast said, "Come on, you're coming racing with me." So I go racing with Kevin Prendergast, and we were going to Navan, which is northeast of Dublin, a race course there where Kevin had runners. But Kevin had organized a meeting with the stewards of the turf club for me. Mm-hmm. And this is the funniest thing ever. I walk into this meeting with the stewards of the turf club, and they sit there all official, with their hats on and everything. And I'm standing there thinking, what am I doing here? And they said, "Right, we got our, you want to obtain an amateur license." I said, "I don't. Kevin Prendergast wants me to get an amateur license." I said, "I have no interest in getting an amateur license." And because Kevin Prendergast was a very big name in Ireland at that time.
Indeed. Yeah.
And I wasn't a name. I was just a kid. So they ignored what I said and just issued the license. Piece of paper, kind of thing, blah, blah, blah. So we go on, and Kevin says, "Right, you can ride Prom on Monday." Prom was a lead horse for all these good horses. And he was a difficult horse to ride. But Kevin thought I got on well with this horse. So on the Monday, it was the first day of the Rose of Tralee Racing Festival. And the big race at the Rose of Tralee Racing Festival was an amateur race called the Denny's Heavy Snack. And I rocked up at the races on the Monday, not even really known if I have a license to ride or not. And I go in and I get introduced to a valet called Dave Fox, who knew my brothers, and said, "Here, I've got all your gear here, Declan, blah, blah, blah." And I had to go out to make sure that my license had been made official. So I go out to ride in this race, and I'm riding a horse, he's 16-1, 20-1. Nobody has heard of Declan Murphy, and Prom was a light of other years. He was an older horse. And they didn't think that anything could happen here. But anyway, I settled this horse beautifully in a race of 15, 18 runners, I think there was. Right. And I rocked up turning into the straight, and I had Willie Mullins, who was a leading amateur at the time, and Ted Walsh in front of me. Yeah. And I thought, this is fun, because you see these people sort of like on the television.
Yeah, they're big guys, yeah.
And anyway, I, having come from the back of the field, I sailed past them at the furlong pole and got up and I won by about 2 lengths going away.
Excellent.
And at the age of 17, I had made history by winning on my very first ride as a rider. So therefore, that was on June the 21st, 1993. Another month to go before I would go back to school. And in that time, I had ridden several winners because everybody wanted me now. And Kevin had a few horses for me to ride and all this kind of thing. And then I become leading amateur. And I go back to school in September, the 1st of September, in my leaving cert year. And I go back as leading amateur rider.
You're a star now.
Yeah, I'm a star now. Everybody wants to sort of like... And at the time, it was very curious. This is in 1983. At the time, we'd only just gotten a telephone in the house. And it was put halfway up the stairs. I'll never forget this. But the telephone never rang in the house because it would be only used for my mother to call my brother Pat or Raymond who were away and this kind of thing. But from the time that I became leading amateur, that phone never stopped ringing. My mother was having to run up the stairs, and she was effing and blinding about this phone being put on the stairs.
Yeah.
But she had put it there in the first place because it was out of the way. So that went on then, and I became leading amateur in the year that I'm doing my leaving cert. And one day, the state lawyer, John Power, drove up to me. I was out riding a pony, and he said, Barney Curley would like to meet you. And I said, who the hell is Barney Curley? So we go along, and John Power. So that was about the end of May, and John Power knew I was doing my leaving cert. And I don't think any more of this. And one night, I'm sitting down with my mother because I'd done something wrong and I wasn't allowed to go to the disco. So I had to sit at home and I had to watch the Late Late Show with Gay Byrne on the television with my mother. And who was on this show? A guy called Barney Curley. He had just raffled his mansion, and he had raised all this money for this, and he was a gambler, and he said he was going to move all his horses to England, and he was going to pick the best jockey in Ireland to go and ride them. And I'm sitting there, and I said to my mother, my God, if I ever was to ride horses, I'd love to ride them for him, just as a sort of a throwaway comment. Sure. And I finished my leaving cert, and next thing I'm contacted by Barney Curley.
Right.
And he said, would you come and meet me at Mullingar Mansion? And so I rock up and I meet Barney Curley at the mansion in Mullingar, and I'm leading amateur at the time. Barney Curley hadn't really seen me ride, but he'd been told by other people that I was the one that he needed.
Right.
And John Power hadn't allowed Barney Curley to contact me until after my leaving cert. Mm-hmm. So Barney Curley said, I'd wanted to get hold of you, but John Power had told me you were doing your leaving cert and I wasn't to touch you. So I sat down with Barney Curley on 2 armchairs at his mansion in Mullingar that he had just raffled, made millions out of this raffling this mansion. And we're talking away, and he said, what's your plans? And I said, I'm going to go on and study law, and that's the only thing that interests me. I have no interest in riding horses. And we go along, and he said, where's your... I said, I've always had an ambition to go to America. From the age of 14, I used to read the Jenny Bannister American Diaries in the Irish Independent. Jenny Bannister was an Irish girl who was over in America that was documenting her life as a journalist in the west coast of America. And I used to read this sort of piece every Thursday, I think it was, in the Irish Independent. And I had convinced myself at the age of 15 or 16 that I was going to be the lawyer that was going to put America straight. I was going to be the one that was going to really, do this. So I said this to Barney Curley. I said that I want to go to America, but I've got a place here in Ireland. And he said, well, that can work both ways. He said, if you come and ride my horses, I can get you to America to study. So I go from not wanting to be a jockey to agreeing to riding Barney Curley's horses. So I moved to England briefly when Barney Curley moved his horses. And Barney Curley had a horse in the west coast of America with Charlie Whittingham. And he said, you could go there, and I go there, and Charlie Whittingham was the leading trainer in the west coast of America, a legend. He was called the Bold Eagle. And the Bold Eagle, Charlie Whittingham, thought that I was a sensation riding. And Barney Curley asked Charlie Whittingham what was his advice on training racehorses, and Charlie Whittingham said, keep the numbers small, don't train many horses, and never lose that kid Murphy.
Good advice.
So I then explained the thing to Charlie, and Charlie introduced me to UCLA, and I did a written interview, and that's where I then set about my law degree, and that's how it was all going to go. And I funded my law degree because I was getting a retainer from Barney Curley, and I was riding track work at Hollywood Park in Santa Anita. I was living like a king at the age of 18, 19.
Good stuff.
So then, 3 years later, with a year to do at law, I was flying over to ride Barney Curley's horses every weekend or every second weekend, just getting on an airplane, flying to England, flying back. Never thought anything of it at the time. I think about it now. I think, geez, what exhausting.
Yeah.
But I became leading amateur in England. And then the Jockey Club in England said that I was abusing the amateur status. They suggested that I must be getting paid. I couldn't do this otherwise. So they made me turn professional.
Okay.
And I decided with a year to do at law school that I was going to turn professional. That was in 1989. And one of my first rides as a professional, and I was only going to do it for a year. One of my first rides was for the legend Tommy Stack. And I won the Irish champion hurdle for him at Leopardstown in 1989 on a horse called Kingsmill.
Okay.
And this had now launched my career as a professional rider. And straight after that, on the back of that, I get offered a job as first jockey to Josh Gifford. Josh Gifford was one of the biggest trainers in the UK at that time. He was a legend. And I end up having this conversation with Josh Gifford saying that I'm not really going to stay that long riding, and he said, doesn't matter, you just come and ride. You can have the pick of all my horses. So I end up getting the job as first jockey to Josh Gifford, and getting a retainer from him, and now I'm earning good money, and I'm thinking, this is mad, you know. I'm a student. And I end up winning most of the big races. Within 2 years of riding for Josh Gifford, I'd won the Queen Mother Champion Chase at the Cheltenham Festival. I'd won
You rode for the Queen. You rode for the Queen.
Yes, that's right. And then I won the Mackenzie Gold Cup on a horse called Bradbury Star, also for Josh Gifford. And then I won the Triple Brain Gold Cup for a legend at the time called Martin Pipe. So I end up winning all these races, and I am, you know, sort of like the person everybody sort of wanted, and it was just crazy how the whole thing was going. And then in 1990, so I stayed at it a bit longer than I had planned. I was in my fourth year as a professional, having been at the top all the time. And I went to Haydock Park to ride the favourite for the last big race of the year. And I'd won most of the big races throughout that year. And I rocked up to ride what would be the favourite or the second favourite. And I went out to ride. I was giving the horse a lovely ride. He was giving me a great feel. I was in perfect rhythm with the horse's stride pattern, just like I would be in any given race on any given day.
Right.
And as we jumped the second last hurdle, I have just put myself in a position to go and win this race. And as I just let out a half an inch of rein, I got the inclination the horse wasn't going as well as I thought he was. And I had to make a tactical maneuver, was to try and shorten his stride, to try and sustain his run. You know, it's like a car with limited fuel. You just got to drive it carefully, change down gear, and just try to... So this was my way of trying to secure the best finishing position, because I didn't think I'd win. I might be second, And we went to the last hurdle. And in a moment's mistrust, the horse that I'm riding launched at the hurdle. And when he launched at the hurdle, he broke his pelvis. And as the momentum of his stride was going forward, I go forward with him. And as he broke his pelvis, his head flung back and hit my head and knocked me unconscious before I hit the ground. And when I hit the ground, the horse was stricken at one side and I was laying on the other side, and a horse coming from behind, ridden by a great friend of mine, a pony racing friend called Charlie Swan. He did everything to avoid me. The horse that he was riding, Charlie was trying to steer him over the stricken horse away from me on the ground.
Right.
And the horse that he was riding chose the smaller of the two objects in front of him and landed on my head, shattering my skull in 12 places. And when I was lying on the ground, I'm unconscious and I'm bleeding from every orifice. And the paramedics arrived to exercise me. And basically, one of the paramedics suspected, when they were putting me on the stretcher, that I was bleeding from the brain, that this is a lot worse than what it looked like. And he made a maneuver, putting me on the stretcher. He put his hand underneath my skull to open my air pipes to prevent me from suffocating on my own blood.
Okay.
And that was the first decision that was made that kept me alive for the next 5 minutes, if I was still alive. I'm put in the ambulance and I'm taken to the nearest hospital, which the racetrack was at Haydock Park, which is in the northwest of England. And the nearest hospital was 7 miles away. And at this hospital, they decided I wouldn't live through an operation. And they got me on a life support machine and transferred me to the Walton Centre of Neurology, which was 27 miles away in Liverpool.
Okay.
On the way to the first hospital, I had a seizure, and they thought I had died in that moment. And on the second, when I was on the life support machine, I had a second seizure on the way to the Walton Centre of Neurology. The hospital was being escorted by a police escort. So they were going through every light, everything. There was no hold up. And they got me there in 16 minutes or 17 minutes, so I forget the time exactly. But they got me there with 4 minutes to keep me alive on the life support machine. And when I was brought into the Walton Centre of Neurology, the surgeon on duty looked at the CT scan that had been done at the Warrington Hospital.
Didn't look good, I'm sure.
And decided that she didn't think I would live through the operation. So she consulted the senior surgeon who was out playing golf on the Wirral. And she described the situation to him. And he said to her, just shave his head and mark out where the skull needs to be opened up. And I will get there as soon as I can. And John Miles, Professor John Miles, got to the hospital, and his only job, essentially, was to try and keep me alive. That was the purpose of the exercise. But when they cut my skull open, so what they do is they took all the hair off and basically marked out where they were going to cut the skull open with a sewing wire. They cut my skull in half and peeled it off and went in to suction out the 2 blood clots. But when they went to do this, they realized that one of the blood clots was outside the main dura, which is a lining that covers the brain, which is inside the skull. But the other blood clot was inside the dura. And essentially, when you cut through the dura of the brain, no surgeon will ever do it. It's like the result is not going to be good if you go in there. But John Miles did it without any hesitation and suctioned out the blood clot. And when they did it, they had to interfere with the main nerve to the body and to my right eye. And at that point, the operation was to keep me alive. At no point was it ever considered that I was going to be in any state of recovery. But at that moment, I was going to be kept alive, if until the next moment. So when the operation finished, the operation went on for 18 hours. When the operation finished, John Miles asked to speak to the person at the hospital who is the spokesperson for the family.
Right.
And he explained to my brother Pat, who was the spokesperson at this point, he explained that Declan has had a serious trauma to the brain. We have finished the operation now. And if he lives the next 3 hours, I would have a 50-50 chance of living 6 hours after that.
Not good.
And if I'm still alive after those 6 hours, I will probably never come out of a coma. And so my family are now briefed at this point, and I'm taken out of the theatre, and I'm now in a ward on a life support machine.
You're still in Liverpool, yeah?
Yeah, still at the Walton Centre of Neurology. I'm in the ward now on a life support machine. And what happens when you're in a coma? They do what is termed as a sink or swim trial. What this means is they remove you from the life support machine and reattach you to the wall oxygen to see if you're able to breathe on the wall oxygen. And after the first attempt, I wasn't breathing on the wall oxygen, so they got the life support machine back on. And this is a trial that they would do 3 times. And the second time failed again. And the third time, when they took the life support machine off, and when they were attaching the wall oxygen, I leaned forward on the bed and just collapsed. And they thought I had died in that moment. And they went to my family and said, we consider now might be a time that we have to consider switching off the life support machine. And my sister, who was now sort of spokesperson, she had come from Ireland. She was my eldest sister. And my brother had to go home. And my sister took over the role. And she said to the surgeon that this decision can't be made because my parents are not here. And it's a parent's prerogative to make that decision.
Correct.
So my sister Geraldine called my brother Pat, who was the spokesperson before she arrived, and Pat called my parents in Ireland. And when Pat called my parents in Ireland, there was already a television crew at the door of our house getting a reaction to my death.
Wow.
And in that moment, when Pat explained that they needed them at the hospital, and my mother said, right, we will prepare, we will come. And my father, who had never been on an airplane in his life, and nobody ever knew if he had or hadn't, or well, everybody knew he hadn't been on an airplane, but nobody ever knew he had a fear of flying or anything like that. But he declared a morbid fear of flying and said, we will go by boat.
Right.
And essentially, if my parents had got on an airplane, they would have been at the hospital within about 3.5 hours, 4 hours max. You know, by the time you get to the airport, fly, land, thing. And about 8 hours later, 2 hours before they would arrive by boat, I woke up. And the moral of the story was that if my father had got on an airplane, the life support machine would have been switched off and I would have been dead. But when I woke up, I was 27 years old. I was a world champion horse rider. But in my head, I woke up mentally 12 years old.
Right.
I was a kid. I had no memory of anything beyond that. It's where I lived through in my coma.
You basically lost your memory.
Yeah, well, basically, it was more like that when I was in the coma, I was living through my childhood all over again. Mm-hmm. And the wheels of life stopped turning the moment that I woke up, and that was when I was 12 years old. Okay. So when you are in this state of being, the surgeon at the hospital, what they do is they start asking you questions about who is the prime minister, or what country you're from, or this type of this kind of procedure.
You woke up and said Maggie Thatcher's the prime minister.
No, I woke up and I said Gareth Fitzgerald.
Okay, not bad.
With the Taoiseach, right? And I went on, and then, of course, none of this made any sense to them, and they realized that I'm potentially brain dead, that I'm not, there's no function. But there was a friend of mine who I had got a job I got him a job in England, and he was the same age as me in Ireland. And he was stood at the door when this conversation was going on, and he said, this all makes sense. He said, Gareth Fitzgerald was the Taoiseach when Declan was 12.
Yes.
And the people he's talking about were all there at that time when he was 12. Mm. And now they realize this is serious now. Yeah. It all makes sense, but it makes no sense. Mm-hmm. How am I stuck there? How is there no sort of way forward?
But you hit pause and then...
Yes, absolutely. Mm. So they realize a day later, 2 days later, a couple of days later, the surgeon came and sat at my bed and he said that, Declan, you've had a mega brain trauma, and you may never walk again. You may never feel again. How are you coping? And the whole thing just went over my head. It just didn't sort of make sense. So I decided then at some point in the next couple of weeks that the hospital was making me feel unwell.
Right.
Initially, I didn't want the curtains closed at the hospital because I wasn't able to differentiate between day and night. I didn't know which was which. And if the curtains closed, it was like as if everything was closing in on me.
Right.
And so after a couple of weeks, I sort of decided that the hospital was making me feel unwell. And I wanted to go home. But of course, the home that I had was very different to the home that I had in my head.
Right.
I was living in England and not in Ireland.
Right.
And it was agreed that I could go home if my girlfriend at the time, Joanna, along with 2 nurses, would be with me at all times.
Right.
This was how the whole thing had to unfold. So when I get home to the house that I don't remember, and I'm sitting there and I've lost 50% of my body weight. And I have no feeling in my feet or in my hands. I'm not able to walk, but the nurses would take me each day with one hold on each arm, helping me to try and move. And a couple of months later, I decided I could do this myself. And
Your
I
body,
started, say again?
your body's starting to heal now.
Well, my body is starting to heal, but the problem was that the signals from the brain were not getting to
Right.
to the body.
Okay.
So, to eloquent on that a little bit, I didn't know if I was right-handed, left-handed.
Okay.
I didn't know if I was going to take a step forward on my two sticks, if it was my right leg or left leg would go.
Right.
There was no way of
Differentiate.
dictating this sort of thing. So for several months, well, I'll go back a bit. After about a month of doing this, I decided I could walk on my own on the sticks. And I walked what was about 50 meters at the time on these two sticks on the grass. And I looked up at the sky. It was a beautiful day. And I remember thinking, everything is possible. I've just done this. They said I could never do it.
Right.
Everything is possible. And from that moment, I was inspired to just try and repair myself in whatever way possible. And as I started to learn to walk again, as I started to learn to do things again, I was fighting an awful turmoil in my head where islands of memory kept coming floating back. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's like you're getting pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that you're putting in place. And none of it makes sense until it makes sense.
Okay.
And I had this sort of three-way war going on within me, my physical self and my mental self and my spirit. It's like one was at war with each other. It was just like a crazy state of being. But whilst all of this is happening, I'm trying to repair my physical self. And I understood at this point the reason why I was struggling was because the medication was making me feel awful. But the medication was very important because it was to reduce the swelling in my brain.
Okay.
But I decided I was going to wean myself off the medication because it was affecting me in a very negative way.
Okay.
And I told nobody. And I then started I was having terrible nightmares. I was having conscious nightmares, unconscious nightmares. I was having all sorts of chaos in my head. And about 6 months later, 8 months later, maybe 9 months, I start now to walk barefooted with two sticks. And I was walking barefooted because I was trying to stimulate feeling in my feet.
Right.
And this was madness at a certain point because I'd walked on broken glass and didn't realize I had, and the whole thing was bleeding and glass, and I didn't even see it, didn't even feel it.
Okay.
So then I get past that stage and I start now to be able to walk very cagily, tenderly, without a stick. And I started walking, bouncing a golf ball off the ground, trying to catch one with each finger like that. Every time it bounced up, trying to stimulate the feeling in my hands.
Right.
So all the things that I was doing, it was a case of trial and error. It was a case of just trying to get to the next stage. And when I got myself to what I considered to be a good state of being, that I was able to walk really reasonably well, I was going to try to run a little bit now, just jog a little bit or something. But I was still fighting these nightmares. I didn't know what was going on inside my head. And one day, Barney Curley had come to my house just to see how I was doing. And whilst he was stood in the kitchen of my house, he took an intake of his cigarette he was smoking. And on the exhale, the smoke created like a...
Cloud?
No, like a flame in my head.
Okay.
That I didn't recognize Barney Curley in the context of him standing in my kitchen. I recognized him as the person I'd seen on the television. And none of this was making any sense. And I ran out of my own house at that point on my weakened legs. And they drove after me in the car. And I ran behind an allotment and fell down behind a shed in an allotment. And I cried my eyes out, thinking I was losing control of my own mind. And I had no way of controlling it. And I picked myself up from that. And a couple of days later, or maybe a week later, I decided I was going to try and run. And I tried to run. My house was in Newmarket, which is in Suffolk. It's a training headquarters, or a horse training headquarters in England. And I went to have a run on this artificial surface, training surface, because it was soft. And I ran a couple of 100 yards and my legs went into spasm. And I crumpled to the ground with pain that I'd never experienced ever. It was excruciating. And I was losing consciousness. And I'm looking at the sky, aware that I'm losing consciousness, and I'm trying to fight against the closing of the light, if you like this. And I managed to stay conscious, and somebody came and picked me up and brought me back. And that knocked me back a little bit. It was like what I call in my book, I describe it as a momentum breaker. I had several momentum breakers. But this is a part that I describe in a chapter of my book, Big Boys Don't Cry. Because I describe how on so many times I was practically completely broken, but I found a way to get back up. And there's another chapter after Big Boys Don't Cry that are two of the most important chapters in my book. It's called Entrapment, and I describe about how I was fighting against the closing in of my own mind. I realized that the mind is the thing that cowers.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say my guest today is Declan Murphy. His book is called Centaur. He's telling me an exciting story. His life growing up in Limerick and then becoming a world-renowned jockey and dealing with, I guess you might call it, life after death, which is the name of this. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, and I'll hand back to Declan now to continue on with his miraculous story, I would call it, yeah.
So in the chapter of my book titled Entrapment, I talk about how my mind was trying to close in on me. It was the mind is the first thing that cowers. It's like if you go to touch a hot plate, you move because your mind is already decided. It's not because you haven't felt it. It's not a feeling. And that's a bit what was happening with my mind, with everything that I did. It was cowering. And at that point, I had become aware of my own spirit within me as being the only thing that was able to sort of get me going forward, that was able to get me going past the closing of the mind, if you like. And I would go on from there. This is maybe 14 months later. And I'd made a reasonably successful recovery physically. I was getting myself strong. I was, doing exercises, things. But the jigsaw puzzle that I had been presented with my own memory was now taking shape in a structured sense, that all the pieces were in place. And when they're all in place, there's a gaping hole. And that gaping hole is 4 years, 6 months, and 24 days that I still don't remember to this day. And there's no understanding how this happens or how it's happened. It's the brain. It's
That's like your brain deleted it out there.
Exactly. It's like a safety mechanism that's built in. It's like a computer. It's like a computer with a spyware, with a kind of a, it'll block something out.
Declan, I want to mention another guest I had on here. He's a scientist from Sloan Kettering Hospital, Sergey Vyanovich, and he deals with brain cancer and brain surgery and all that. And the day before I interviewed Sergey, I met an older gentleman outside having a cup of coffee, and he was telling me his story. He had overcome 5 different cancers, and he was in his maybe 84. And I said, "You look very well for an 84-year-old who has survived cancer." And I said to the older gentleman, I said, "What do you put it down to?" And he said, "Doctors, science, and God." And I said this to Sergey, the scientist, the following day in the interview. And because he's a scientist, I said, "Where does God come into the equation?" And in summary, Sergey said, if I remember rightly, that if you throw in the towel, you're screwed. But if you have hope, you have a better chance of winning. And as far as God is concerned, he said, God is good for your immune system. So I want to know, did you go to God or did God come to you?
Well, this is something that really resonates with my soul, because in my darkest hour, a lot of what I was going through was like crawling through a dark and dangerous tunnel with no promise of light at the other end, other than a belief that there would be when I got there. What was this belief built on? It was built on nothing other than hope.
Hope.
Where did the hope come from? The hope come from the thing that I had felt deep inside of me, which I would later be able to eloquent in a sense that it was my spirit that was talking to me. And this was the only way that I was able to be referee between my physical and mental self. And that was my spirit. Now, people have asked me before to explain this. It's an impossible thing to explain, other than what I take from it is simply this. Belief is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you believe in something, the more you give of yourself to achieving it. Without belief, the fight within you has not begun. And if the fight within you hasn't begun, you dare not get into the ring with anybody. And there's 2 lines in my book that are standouts for me, and one of them is that belief is this self-fulfilling prophecy. And that was the thing that propelled me forward all the time. And it was only because of my spirit that I was able to believe that while crawling through that dark and dangerous tunnel with no promise of light, it was the belief that there would be when I got there that kept me going through that tunnel.
Right. Like a goal.
And if I didn't have that belief, I would have cowered and gone backwards.
Right.
If I had cowered and gone backwards, I would have gone back on medication, and I would have spent the rest of my life being institutionalized. Now, understand the significance of that. No matter how how crazy, how unthinkable the situation is for anybody. The solution always lies within.
Yes.
And this was something that I realized. And after 14, 15 months of physically trying to rebuild my physical self, having had to break down the whole working of my own mind to try to understand what was going on with the chaos in my head.
Right.
I was able to work it out in this way, like the jigsaw puzzle. And one morning, I got on a horse and I was walking. I'd gone on a horse the first time I'd exercised on a horse. And when I got off this horse, I realized something so deeply reassuring, in the sense that as I listened to the horse's hoofbeat, I could feel for the first time my own heartbeat.
Right.
And in that moment, that was the moment that I had accepted what had happened to me.
Okay.
And I was not going to fight it.
Okay.
I'm missing 4 years, 6 months, and 24 days of my life. Nobody needs to know it, but I know it, and I'm not going to fight it. I'm going to accept it. And that was the moment that I was able to move forward. And that is the thing that helped me move forward, was that acceptance. Acceptance is the key. It's the only way you can move on from the trauma that I had suffered. And 3 months after that, I would get back on a horse in a race. Everybody thought it was crazy. The senior surgeon who did the operation on my head said it was the chance that I was taking was not worth it. He said that if you have a fall, you will die. But what nobody understood was I had to get back to the closest thing to being me before my accident. And my reason for that was that I knew that I didn't remember part of my life that people revered me for.
Right.
But I didn't remember that.
Right.
And the only way that I thought that I could achieve this was to ride in a race again. And that will then meet this sort of the satisfaction of everybody else. And
Right.
I didn't know how I would feel, but I get back on a horse 18 months after I was pronounced dead. There was one little thing that I forgot to say, was that a great friend at the time, Father Patsy Foley, had come to issue the last rites just before I woke up, which was incredible. And but I got back on a horse and I rode in a race and I won it. And I remember when I won this race, I was overcome with all sorts of emotion, delight, but the overwhelming emotion that I felt was a sense of relief. A sense of relief because I knew how narrowly I had escaped.
Yes.
And how lucky I had got.
Yes.
And I walked back into the winner's enclosure and told nobody, and just walked away and retired. And a couple of months later, I launched a television channel. A year later, I had raised the money to open a pain relief center at the Walton Center of Neurology that hadn't opened because of a lack of government funding.
Very good.
And 2 years after that, I designed a helmet that became compulsory for every jockey in the world to ride, which was 115% more protection than the helmet I was wearing when I had my accident.
You should be very proud of yourself.
So I'm proud of my legacy. I'm proud of what I did, but I was able to walk away with peace in my heart.
Right.
And find my own self, if you like.
Right.
And I went back to being the curious kid that I was when I was 12, 14 years old. and became a completely different person. I worked in television. I went back to law. I did, things that I felt I hadn't been given the opportunity to. So I'm very grateful for the life that I have.
Sometimes I come across not too many people like yourself, because your story is so unique, but people that have that near-death experience and they think that's it, they're gone. But when they get the second chance, it's like a brand new life, and they start a more positive outlook in life. They're more kind, they're more generous, and they actually enjoy and love living life because they realize you got a second chance.
And, I would take that stage further, if you like. I consider my professional life before I had my accident as being a finite life.
Right.
And I've ended up with a life since my accident, which has become infinite.
Right.
Infinite with possibilities, infinite with opportunities.
Right.
In a way that my whole life has been built on giving a little back at every moment I can.
That qualifies my point.
And this enriches my life in a way that every day I wake up in the morning and I realize how grateful I am to be alive. And knowing that every day I wake, I know only I can make myself a loser. Right. It's not circumstance, it's not anything. Only I can make myself a loser. The solution to everything is within me, within my own compass.
Yeah, you can make a decision to be sad, you can make a decision to be happy too.
Exactly.
My guest today is Declan Murphy. My podcast is called It's Good to Talk. If you like the podcast, subscribe. It's free to subscribe. And you can get Declan's book on Amazon. It's called Centaur. And it's like my astrology sign. I'm a Sagittarius. So it's like half man, half horse. There's a connection between the brain of the horse and the brain of the rider, that they're in sync, which is a gift to have. Horses are intelligent, and Declan Murphy is an intelligent man. So let's chat a little bit more, Declan.
Yes. I like what you just said there, because like Centaur, the title of my book, is the Greek mythology, which is the body of the horse and the head of the man. Right. And the importance of this, and the reason why that's relevant to my story, is because as a horse rider, I had a symmetry in the way that I rode horses. I rode horses in a way that I was always within rhythm with the horse's stride pattern. And in many ways, I suppose, even though I don't remember 4 years, 6 months and 24 days, 6 months and 24 days of my life is built on sustaining that rhythm that I felt on horseback in real life.
Right.
So I'm quite laid back as a person. I am not fazed by anything. It's I have an approach that leads me to wanting to do something good or positive in every moment that I am alive.
That comes across in your personality.
Yeah, because in life, John, we're either givers or takers.
Right.
And I, like most people, at some point in my life, I would have been a taker. But I've ended up being a giver in a capacity that I would never, ever have imagined. Right. And my life is so much better as a consequence of that.
Good. Well, you have better energy. You feel better, if you do.
Of course, because I'm completely unencumbered by baggage.
Right.
I'm seamless.
Right.
I don't worry. Worry is interest paid on trouble before it's due. So what's the point in worrying?
No point to worry.
Because you can deal with everything. It's your approach and how you approach it.
How you approach it.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. All right. It's been a pleasure talking to Declan Murphy. His book is called Centaur, and I know it's on Amazon. I'm sure it's on other. If people just Google Declan Murphy Centaur, they'll find you, I'm sure. Now you're back in New York, so I don't know if you're doing book launches or book readings. I know when I did my book, it came out at the beginning of the COVID thing, and it upset the situation for everybody that's launched the book at that time, you know.
Yes, of
The
course.
other thing I might say about when I helped Stoney with this book, because it took two of us to write it, and at the end of it, I told him that it was like therapy for him, because it's good you get everything out of your system from that point of view. So
Well,
if it was
the,
therapy for him, after working with him for 2 years, I felt I needed therapy.
yeah, I can imagine. But it's funny that you mentioned that, because in many ways, I didn't tell my story for 15 years. I turned down 3 lucrative offers to do a book. I never wanted to do a book.
Right.
And I ended up doing a book, not by choice. The situation was almost imposed upon me.
Right.
And I co-authored my own book. But the whole way through the book, I never once thought that it was a book. It was like a delayed therapy for me.
Right.
It had become cathartic.
Right.
It was my way of setting myself free of myself.
Getting everything out of your system.
Exactly that.
Right.
And the first mention that anybody knew that I still don't remember 4 years, 6 months, and 24 days of my life was in my book. I'd
Right.
never told my family.
Right.
I'd never wanted to share it with anybody because I always felt that people would consider you imperfect or something in some way. So I felt that I had to prove myself in life and not be encumbered by the lack of memory. And I've proved that. So now I'm like the bird that's been set free.
Right. Fantastic.
And that's a beautiful thing, to be able to achieve that in life.
Well, Declan, it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
It's been a great pleasure of me to meet you and end up talking with you and joining you on your podcast. So I'm really delighted.
Your story is unique and interesting. So my guest was Declan Murphy, book Santor. You can get it on Amazon. I'm John D Healy. Book podcast is called It's Good to Talk. It's sure good to listen. I did a lot of listening today. And tune in again when I'll have another interesting guest on. I'll say Slán go fóill, yeah?
Slán lad.
Slán lad. Okay, thank you, Declan.
Thank you, John.